Dear students, in the previous session, we have discussed about the pruning of mulberries, harvesting of mulberries, precautions for harvesting and pest management. We have also discussed about the preservation of mulberry leaves. In this session, let me introduce you to history of silkworm, the process of silk cultivation, the role of industrial revolution in silk, the importance of silk in the medieval and modern times. In marriage functions and other parties, you might have observed women looking elegant and gorgeous in silk sarees. Definitely, no other fabric can match the qualities of silk. But have you ever wondered how silk fabric came into existence? Silk production, or sericulture as it is known, has a long history unknown to most of us. Coming to the history of the silkworm, which is also the story of silk, goes back to ancient times in China. Some of the stories have been handed down through the generations and are probably based partly on fact and partly on legend and myth. The tale persists that about 2640 BC, the Chinese empress Shi Lingqi was watching the glistening amber cocoons that little worms were spinning in the mulberry trees in the palace gardens. As she tried to gather the cocoons, she accidentally dropped one of them into a bowl of hot tea. While trying to recover the cocoon from the hot liquid with a spoon, she discovered that a very fine and very long lustrous thread unwound itself from the cocoon. Fascinated by its appearance, she pulled strands from several cocoons through her ring to form a thicker thread. She discovered the silk and the process of obtaining it from the cocoons. Eventually, with the help of her ladies of the court, she spun the threads into a beautiful piece of cloth to make a robe for the Emperor Huang Ti. The magnificent material, silk, then known as the cloth of kings. Then the silk industry came into existence. For thousands of years, only the royal family of China used silk. The Chinese kept the secret of how silk was made for 2500 years. The silk material was sold to the rulers of the West, but the source of the shiny thread that made the silk material was not revealed. The penalty in China for telling that the silk came from the cocoons of the little worms was death. So, some very strange ideas were formulated as to the origin of silk. Here are few. Silk came from the colored petals of flowers in the Chinese desert. Silk was made of extraordinarily soft soil. Silk came from the spider-like animal that ate until it burst open, and silk threads were found inside its body. And silk came from the silky fuzz on special leaves. These ideas seem implausible today, but in ancient times they were serious theories. The legend was that the Japanese carried off 4 Chinese maidens who knew the secret of silk along with mulberry shoots and silk moth eggs. Today, Japan is the leading producer of silk. Another story was that a Chinese princess married an Indian prince. She carried silkworm eggs and mulberry shoots in her elaborate headdress and the secret of raising silkworm in her head, thus spreading the culture of silk to India. Finally, two poor monks told Emperor Justinian of Constantinople that they had learnt the secret of silk. Justinian sent them back to China to get some eggs and mulberry shoots for him. They returned many years later with the eggs and shoots hidden inside their hollowed out walking sticks. Since Justinian was the emperor of Constantinople across the road cities, the secret soon spread throughout the Europe. There are many more interesting stories about the history of silk. According to Chinese tradition, the history of silk began in the 27th century BCE. Its use was confined to China until the Silk Road opened at some point during the later half of the first millennium BC. China maintained its virtual monopoly over silk for another 1,000 years. Silk was not confined to clothing. It was also used for a number of other applications, including writing. The color of the silk worn was an important indicator of social class during the Tang dynasty. Silk cultivation spread to Japan around 300 CE, and by 522 CE, the Byzantines managed to obtain silkworm eggs and were able to begin silkworm cultivation. The Arabs also began to manufacture silk during the same time. As a result of the spread of sericulture, Chinese silk exports became less important, although they still maintained dominance over the luxury silk market. The Crusades brought silk production to Western Europe, in particular to many Italian states, which saw an economic boom in exporting silk to the rest of Europe. Changes in manufacturing techniques also began to take place during the Middle Ages, with devices such as spinning wheel first appearing. During the 16th century, France joined Italy in developing a successful silk trade, though the efforts of most other nations to develop a silk industry of their own were unsuccessful. The Industrial Revolution changed much of Europeans' silk industry. Due to innovations in spinning cotton, cotton became much cheaper to manufacture, therefore caused more expensive silk production to become less important. However, new weaving technologies increased the efficiency of silk production. Among them was the jacquard loom, which was developed for silk embroidery. An epidemic of several silkworm diseases caused production to fall, especially in France, where the industry never recovered. In the 20th century, Japan and China regained their earlier role in silk production, and China is now once again the world's largest producer of silk. The rise of new fabrics such as nylon reduced and the prevalence of silk throughout the world. The silk is now once again a rare luxury good and much less important this day. With regard to silk cultivation in China, it was originally restricted to women, and many women were employed in the silk making industry. Even though some saw the development of a luxury product as useless, silk provoked such a craze among high society that the rules in the Li Ji were used to limit its uses to the members of their imperial family. For approximately a millennium, the right to wear silk was reserved for the emperor and the highest dignitaries. Later, it gradually extended to other classes of Chinese society. Silk began to be used for decorative means and also in less luxurious ways like musical instruments, fishing, and bow making. Peasants did not have the right to wear silk until the Qing dynasty, which was between 1644 and 1911. Paper was one of the greatest discoveries of ancient China. In the beginning of 3rd century BCE, paper was made in all sizes with various materials. Silk was no exception, and silk workers have been making paper since 2nd century BCE. Silk, bamboo, linen, wheat and rice straws were all used differently, and the paper made with silk became the first type of luxury paper. Researchers have found an early example of writing done on silk paper in the tomb of a Marchioness who died around 168 in Mawangdui, Hunan. The material was certainly more expensive but also more practical than bamboo slips. Treatises on many subjects including meteorology, medicine, astrology and even maps written on silk had been discovered. During the Han Dynasty, silk became progressively more valuable in its own right and became more than simply a material. It was used to pay government officials and compensate citizens who were particularly worthy. By the same token that one would sometimes estimate the prices of products according to a certain weight of gold. The length of a silk cloth became a monetary standard in China in addition to bronze coins. The wealth that brought to China stirred envy in neighboring peoples. In the beginning of 2nd century BCE, the Xiongnu regularly pillaged the provinces of Han Chinese for around 250 years. Silk was a common offering by the emperor to these tribes in exchange of peace. The military payrolls tell us that soldiers were paid in bundles of plain silk textiles, which circulated as currencies in Han times. Soldiers have traded their silk with the nomads who came to the gates of the Great Wall to sell horses and furs. For more than a millennium, silk remained the principal diplomatic gift of the Emperor of China to his neighbors or to his vassals. The use of silk became so important that silk soon constituted one of the principal radicals of Chinese script. Broadly speaking, the use of silk was regulated by a very precise code in China. For example, the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty imposed upon bureaucrats the use of particular colors according to their different functions in society. Under the Ming, silk began to be used in a series of accessories like handkerchiefs, wallets, belts, or even an embroidered pieces of fabric displaying dozens of animals, real or mythical. These fashion accessories remained associated with a particular position. They were a specific bonnet for warriors, for judges, for nobles, and others for religious use. The women of high Chinese society heeded codified practices and used silk in their garments, to which they added countless motifs. The start of the Industrial Revolution was marked by a massive boom in the textile industry with remarkable technological innovations led by the cotton industry of Great Britain. In its earlier years, there were often disparities in technical innovations between different stages of fabric manufacture, which encouraged complementary innovations. For example, spinning progressed much more rapidly than weaving. However, silk industry did not gain any benefit from innovations in spinning, as silk is naturally already a thread. Making silk, silver and gold brocades is a very delicate and precise process, with each color needing its own dedicated shuttle. In the 17th century and 18th century, progress made to be in the simplification and standardization of silk manufacture, with many advances following one after another. Boken and Falcon's punched card loom appeared in 1775, later improved on by Jacques de Vaucanson. Later, Joseph Marie Jacquard improved on the designs of Falcon and Vaucanson, introducing the revolutionary Jacquard loom, which allowed a string of punched cords to be processed mechanically in the correct sequence. The punched cards of the Jacquard loom were a direct precursor to the modern computer in that they gave a limited form of programmability. The punched cards themselves were carried to computers and were ubiquitous until their obsolescence in 1970. From 1801, embroidery became highly mechanized due to the effectiveness of the Jacquard loom. The mechanism behind the Jacquard loom even allowed complex designs to be mass produced. Jacquard loom was immediately denounced by workers who accused it of causing unemployment, but soon it had become vital to the industry. The loom was declared public property in 1806 and the Jacquard was rewarded with a pension and a royalty on each machine. In 1834, there were a total of 2,885 Jacquard looms in Lyon alone. In 1831, the Kennett revolt foreshadowed many of the worker unrest in the Industrial Revolution. The Kennets occupied the city of Lyon and would not relinquish it until a bloody repression by the army, which was led by Marshal Soult. A second revolt similar to the first took place in 1834. Coming to the silk development in the medieval period, the high Middle Ages saw continued use of established techniques for silk manufacture without any changes to speak of, neither in materials nor in tools used. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, small changes began to appear, though the changes of 13th century was much larger and more radical. In a short time, new fabrics began to appear. Hemp and cotton also had their own particular techniques of manufacture. Silk remained a rare and expensive material since Roman times. During 6th and 8th century, the Byzantine monasteries in Greece and Syria and those of the Arabs in Sicily and Spain during 8th and 10th century were able to supply the luxury material in much greater abundance. The 13th century witnessed an already changing technology undergone many dramatic changes. At the end of the 18th century, advances in the textile industries were a driving force behind advances in technology as a whole within England. Silk indeed occupied a privileged place in history on account of this. At the start of the 13th century, a primitive form of milling the silk threads was already in use. In 1221, Jean de Garlande's dictionary and in 1226, Tradesman's Handbook enumerated many types of devices, which can only have been doubling machine. The instruments used were further perfected in Bologna between 1270 and 1280. From the start of the 14th century, many documents allude the use of devices that were quite complex. The reel, originally developed for the silk industry, now has multiple uses. The earliest surviving depiction of a spinning wheel is a panel of stained glass in the Cathedral of Chartres. Bobbins and warping machines appear together in the stained glass at Chartres and in a fresco in the Cologne Kunkel House approximately during 1300. It is possible that the toothed warping machine was created by the silk industry. It allowed the warp to be more uniform and allowed the warp to be of longer length. At the end of the 14th century, no doubt on account of the devastation caused mid-century by the Black Death, there was a general shift towards less expensive techniques. Many things which would have earlier been completely forbidden by the guilds were now commonplace, like using low quality wool, cording, etc. In the silk industry, the use of water-powered mills grew, and by the 15th century, the loom designed by Jean Le Calabrese saw nearly universal use. Italian silk cloth was very expensive, as much a result of the cost of the raw material as of the production cost. The craftsmen in Italy proved unable to keep up with the exigencies of French fashion, which continued demanded lighter and less expensive materials. These materials were used for clothing, and garment production began to be done locally. Nevertheless, Italian silk long remained among the most prized mostly for furnishings and the brilliant colors of the dyes. Following the example of the wealthy Italian city, the states of the era such as Venice, Florence and Lucca, which had become the center of the luxury textile industry. Lyon obtained a similar function in the French market. In 1466, King Louis XI decided to develop a national silk industry in Lyon. In the face of protest by the Lyonnais, he conceded and moved the silk fabrication to Tours, but the industry in the Tours stayed relatively marginal. His main objective was to reduce France's trade deficit with Italy, which caused France to lose 4 lakh to 5 lakh golden écus a year. Écus means a former money of the European common market. It was under Francis I in around 1535 that a royal charter was granted to two merchants to develop a silk trade in Lyon. In 1540, the king granted a monopoly on silk production to the city of Lyon. In the 16th century, the Lyon became the capital of the European silk trade, notably producing many reputable fashions. Gaining confidence, the silk produced in the city began to abandon the original Oriental styles in favor of their distinctive style, which emphasized landscapes. Thousands of workers, the Kanads, devoted themselves to the flourishing industry. In the middle of the 17th century, over 14,000 looms were used in Lyon, and the silk industry fed a third of city's population. The first silkworm diseases begin to appear in 1845, creating an epidemic. Among them are pebrine caused by Microsporidia, Nosema bombycis, grassery caused by a virus, flatchery caused by eating infected mulberry leaves, or white muscadine disease caused by the fungus Beauveria bassiana. The epidemic grew to a massive scale, and after having attacked the silkworm, other viruses began to infect the mulberry trees. The chemist Jean-Baptiste Dumas, French Minister of Agriculture, was charged with stopping the epidemic. In face of sericulturists' call for help, he asked Louis Pasteur to study the disease in 1865. For many years, Pasteur thought that pebrine was not a contagious disease. In 1870, he changed his view and measures were enacted that the disease to decline. Nevertheless, the increase in the price of silkworm cocoons and the reduction in the importance of silk in the garments of bourgeoisie in the 19th century caused the decline of the silk industry in Europe. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the silk shortage in France reduced the price of importing Asian silk, particularly from China and Japan. Starting from the Long Depression, that is between 1873 and 1896, Lyonnais silk production had become totally industrialized and handlooms were rapidly disappearing. The 19th century saw the textile industry's progress caused by advances in chemistry. The synthesis of aniline was used to make mauve, that is the aniline purple dye, and the synthesis of quinine was used to make indigo dye. In 1884, Count Hilaire de Chardonnot invented artificial silk and in 1891 opened a factory dedicated to the production of artificial silk called viscose, which cost much less and in part replaced natural silk. Following the crisis in Europe, the modernization of sericulture in Japan made it the world's foremost silk producer. Italy managed to rebound from the crisis, but France was never able to. Urbanization in Europe saw many French and Italian agricultural workers leave silk growing for more lucrative factory work. Raw silk was imported from Japan to fill the void. Asian countries, formerly exporters of raw materials, that is cocoons and raw silk, progressively began to export more and more finished garments. During the Second World War, silk supplies from Japan were cut off, so Western countries were forced to find substitutes. Synthetic fibers such as nylon were used in the products such as parachutes and stockings, replacing silk. Even after the war, silk was not able to regain many of the markets lost, though it remained an expensive luxury product. Post-war Japan, through improvements in technology and a protectionist market policy, became the world's foremost exporter of raw silk, a position it held until the 1970s. The continued rise in importance of synthetic fibers and loosening of the protectionist economy contributed to the decline of Japan's silk industry, and by 1975 it was no longer a net exporter of silk. With its recent economic reforms, the People's Republic of China has become the world's largest silk producer. In 1996, it produced 58,000 tons out of a world production of 81,000 tons, followed by India at 13,000 tons. Japanese production is now marginal at only 2,500 tons. Between 1995 and 1997, Chinese silk production went down 40% in an effort to raise prices, reminiscent of earlier shortages. In December 2006, the General Assembly of United Nations proclaimed 2009 to be the International Year of Natural Fibers, so as to raise the profile of silk and other natural fibers. In this session, we have learnt about history of silkworm, silk cultivation and role of industrial revolution in silk. We have also discussed about silk in the medieval and modern times.